When old Joe Maddox stood before the crowd and placed his last coins on the auction block, every man in town burst into laughter. Who'd want a broken widower, and who'd trust him with 7 scared souls, all branded as unwanted? But as the years passed, the same people who mocked him found themselves at his door, desperate for the very mercy they once refused to show. The morning air at the Willow Bend Fairground was thick with dust and the sour scent of livestock. It was auction day, though the real business had nothing to do with cattle. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern hills, wagons and townsfolk ringed the makeshift platform, their voices rising in a mixture of curiosity, hunger, and cruel amusement. Joe Maddox watched from the shadows, hat pulled low, grief etched deep in the lines around his mouth. They called him the ghost behind his back, a widower, left hollow after disease took his wife 2 winters ago. He kept mostly to himself, tending the last patch of his land, speaking little, trusting less. But that day, something in his chest burned, a memory, maybe, or a promise too long ignored. On the platform, the sheriff and a grim-faced banker barked out the terms: 7 souls, 3 girls, 4 boys, no kin to claim them, no home to go to. Sold as a family or not at all. The eldest, a girl of maybe 16, stood at the front, jaw clenched, shielding the youngest with her body. The smallest, a boy of barely 3, hid his face in her skirts. The crowd shifted, eyes bright with calculation and pity turned sour. The bidding started low and stayed there. No one wanted that many mouths to feed. Jokes flew, sharp as knives. "You taking on a herd or building an army, Maddox? Hope you like noise. Those kids'll drive you mad." Joe said nothing. He simply stepped forward, placed his battered hat and every last dollar he had onto the block. The auctioneer paused, uncertain, but the sheriff nodded. There were no other takers. When Joe walked those children off the platform, the laughter trailed after him like a swarm of flies. The crowd expected failure. Some even expected disaster. But as Joe loaded the wagon, his hand gentle on each child's shoulder, something changed, not in the crowd, but in the quiet resolve in his own heart. He didn't know how he'd feed them or what tomorrow would bring. He only knew what it felt like to lose everything. He saw it now in the hollowed eyes of each child. And as the wagon rolled out of town, away from the jeers, a promise settled deep in his bones. No matter how hard the years, he would never let them be alone again. What no one guessed, not even Joe himself, was that time and hardship would soon turn, and that one day, those who laughed would come begging for a mercy only his strange, makeshift family could give. The road out of Willow Bend twisted through fields gone brittle in the late summer heat, the wagon creaking with every rut and stone. Joe Maddox drove in silence, the weight of 7 anxious children settling heavier than any cargo he'd ever hauled. Behind him, the youngest whimpered softly while the eldest girl, her name, he'd learned, was Ruth, kept her arms tight around the little ones. None of them dared meet his eyes. Joe didn't press them for words. He remembered how language had vanished for him after Mary died, how people's questions sounded like noise when sorrow made every moment roar. He guided the wagon with gentle hands, glancing back now and then to be sure no one had slipped off or fainted from fear. He noticed how Ruth straightened whenever his gaze landed near her, lifting her chin with a stubbornness that was more habit than hope. After an hour, they stopped beside a creek, water glimmering in the sun. Joe passed his battered canteen down the line, making sure even the smallest boy drank. He tore off a hunk of bread, hard and a little stale, and split it into pieces. "Not much," he said quietly, "but it'll do till supper." His voice was rough, unused to kindness, but the words seemed to settle the children. Ruth distributed the bread, eyes never leaving Joe's face, as if she was trying to decipher what kind of man he really was. He squatted near the creek, splashing water over his neck, letting the cold bite through the sweat and nerves. When he looked up, the second eldest, a boy of about 12, watched him from a careful distance. "You got a name, son?" Joe asked, keeping his tone low. The boy hesitated, then answered, "Caleb." Joe nodded. "You look out for your brothers." Caleb's jaw worked, uncertainty flickering. "I try. Pa told me to." Then Pa didn't come back. The words hung there, unfinished. Joe wanted to say something, anything, but he only nodded, letting the silence fill the gap. He understood the ache of unfinished sentences, the way loss left things unsaid. Once the bread was gone and the worst of the thirst quenched, they climbed back into the wagon. The smaller children began to fidget, but Ruth kept them in line with a few whispered words and a fierce look. Joe watched, impressed. She reminded him of Mary, strong and sharp in ways that life demanded and love allowed. The journey was slow, the sun dipping low by the time they reached the edge of Joe's property. The old farmhouse stood weathered but sound, its porch sagging under the weight of years and storms. A vegetable patch choked with weeds sprawled behind the barn. A single cow watched their arrival with lazy indifference. Joe helped each child down from the wagon, calling their names one by one as he learned them. Ruth, Caleb, the twins Sarah and Rachel, Thomas, little Benjamin, and finally Josie, the youngest. He showed them the pump and the outhouse, the garden and the chicken coop. Every word was practical, every gesture careful not to spook them. That first night, the house echoed with unfamiliar sounds, small feet on bare floors, soft sobs muffled in pillows, Caleb's anxious pacing outside the boys' room. Joe lit a lantern and sat on the porch, rubbing his hands together, uncertain if he'd done the right thing. The laughter of the auction crowd haunted him, replaying in his mind. As darkness deepened, Ruth appeared at the door, wrapped in an old quilt. She watched him for a long time, then stepped outside, holding the quilt close. "Are you going to send us away if it gets hard?" she asked, voice trembling but steady. Joe met her gaze, pain and honesty clear in his answer. "I lost everyone I loved. I know what it's like to have nowhere to go. As long as I have breath and land to share, you have a home here." For a moment, Ruth said nothing, her expression softening. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, and turned to go back inside. As she closed the door, Joe heard her whisper to the others, "We'll stay. He means it." Sleep did not come easy that night, for any of them. Joe listened to the creaks and sighs of the old house, to the uncertain breathing of 7 children finding their place in strange beds. But as dawn broke, spilling light across the fields, a tentative sense of hope crept in with the morning breeze. Joe rose early, determined to keep his promise. He knew the days ahead would test every strength he had, and that the world beyond his land would not forgive or forget his choice. But for the first time in years, he felt something like purpose, a chance to build, not just survive. Little did he know, the years ahead would transform not only his own life, but the hearts of the town that once mocked him, and that one day the same voices that jeered would return, desperate for a mercy they no longer deserved. Joe Maddox threw himself into work with a steadiness born of old pain. Each day he woke before the sun, mending fences, tending the overgrown garden, and teaching the older children how to gather eggs and chop wood. He didn't force them into chores, but he asked for help with the kind of gruff respect that makes even a frightened child feel capable. The farm, for so long a quiet place of solitude, came alive with new sounds. The laughter of the twins chasing chickens, the babble of Benjamin at the well, the anxious arguments between Caleb and Thomas over who would milk the cow. Ruth soon became his right hand. She had a knack for order, keeping the littler ones clothed and fed, settling disputes with a glance. She watched Joe closely at first, never quite trusting his kindness. But as the days turned into weeks and no threats of being sent away ever came, a fragile trust began to bloom. In the cool of early morning, she'd sometimes join Joe on the porch, both of them silent, sharing coffee and the sight of dew on the grass. There were hard days, plenty of them. The garden's first yield was thin. Joe sometimes went without so the children could have enough. Caleb cut his hand on a rusty nail. Ruth tended the wound with clean rags and boiled water, refusing to let Joe see her cry afterward. Once, a sickness swept through the little ones, fever and cough, leaving Joe up all night, pacing the kitchen while Ruth sponged their brows and whispered comfort. In those moments, Joe realized just how much he had staked his soul on the promise he'd made. Outside the farm, word of Joe's family traveled fast. At the general store, men snickered or shook their heads. "He'll drown in them," one man predicted. "Give it a month, he'll be begging the sheriff to take them back." The local preacher, however, brought loaves of bread and left them on the porch with a note, "Strength to you and to those you shelter." Others, like Mrs. Beckett, softened as they watched the children grow less wild and more hopeful with each passing week. The real test came that first winter, when a blizzard swept the valley and closed the road for days. The house rattled in the wind, cold seeping through the walls. Joe chopped extra wood, Caleb and Thomas hauling the logs in shifts. Ruth kept a pot of soup simmering, rationing the bread, her voice steady even when she was scared. The storm raged for 3 nights. In the candle-lit dark, the children huddled close on makeshift beds before the fire, and Joe told stories from his youth, tales of river crossings, runaway horses, and Mary's laughter beneath summer rain. That third night, as the wind screamed and snow battered the shutters, Benjamin woke in terror, sobbing for his mother. Ruth rocked him until he calmed, and Joe, heart aching, wrapped his arms around them both. "You're safe here," he promised. "Nobody's leaving. Not tonight, not ever." Ruth's eyes shone in the firelight, and even Caleb, sitting on the far side of the hearth, edged closer, drawn by the warmth of something he'd almost forgotten: family. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was new and blinding white. Joe, Ruth, and the boys shoveled paths to the barn, while the twins filled buckets with snow to melt for water. Laughter returned, cautious but real, as Thomas found a sled in the hayloft and sent Benjamin shrieking down the hill. For the first time, Joe heard his own laughter join theirs, rough and strange but as honest as the sun. Spring arrived slow, coaxed by hard work and hope. The fields grew green again, the garden thick with promise. Ruth planted wildflowers by Mary's grave, telling the little ones stories about the wife they'd never know. Joe watched her, understanding that grief and love could both make things grow. That year, the town began to change its tune. Neighbors stopped to trade seeds or drop off a basket of eggs. Even the banker who'd arranged the auction nodded curtly at Joe in passing, as if respect had been earned in silence. The preacher invited the whole family to Sunday service, and though Joe declined, he noticed the door was always open now, the porch swept clean. Still, Joe never forgot the sting of those first laughs or the way folks had turned away when he'd needed help most. He worked harder than ever, determined that no Maddocks would ever again be left wanting. He took pride in every harvest, every patched shirt, every night spent around the table with the children, now his children, sharing stories and planning for the next day. Yet beneath the comfort of routine, Joe sensed a reckoning ahead. He knew how quickly luck could turn on the frontier, how envy and hardship could bring old cruelty back to his door, and as the years rolled forward, the day would come when the world outside his farm would need him and the family they once mocked more than anyone could imagine. By the third spring, Joe Maddox's farm no longer resembled the silent, haunted place it once was. Wildflowers ringed the vegetable beds, the henhouse overflowed with cackling hens, and the once-worn porch sagged beneath the weight of boots, laughter, and roughhousing. The children had grown, Caleb taller and steady with an axe, Ruth more poised and quick with numbers than Joe himself, the twins lively and mischievous, Thomas and Benjamin sturdy, and Josie chattering in 2 languages. They worked together like a true family. Joe rarely had to remind anyone of their chores. The older children taught the younger, and everyone understood the rhythm of planting, feeding, mending, and gathering. Ruth handled the accounts, Caleb managed the animals, and each night the table groaned beneath bowls of soup and bread, potatoes and wild greens, sometimes even a chicken roasted when the harvest was good. It was Ruth who first noticed how the outside world had begun to shift. One afternoon, as she and Joe sold eggs at the market, a man in a fine coat approached, Mr. Barrett, the banker who had once presided over their auction. He eyed their table with an appraising glance. "Business is good, I see," he remarked, trying to sound pleasant. Ruth kept her chin high. "Hard work and a little luck, sir." Barrett nodded, his tone turning cautious. "You've made something of them, Maddox. I'll admit, I never expected it. Folks in town talk. They say your place is the only one not in debt this year." Joe accepted the compliment with a slow nod. "My children know what it means to go without. We look out for one another. That's all there is to it." Barrett hesitated. "There's talk of a new land tax. The council wants to raise funds. You'll have to pay more than most. 7 dependents, all under your name." Joe's jaw tightened. "We'll manage. We always do." After Barrett left, Ruth watched her father's face, worry flickering in her eyes. "If it comes to it, we'll do more. We can sell preserves or take in sewing, or—" Joe put a hand on her shoulder, grateful for her resolve. "We won't let anyone take this from us, Ruth. Not after all we've built." But the news spread fast. By summer, a new hardship gripped Willow Bend. Crops failed for many, and disease swept through several homesteads. People came knocking, sometimes for a loan of seed, sometimes for advice, sometimes with downcast eyes and empty baskets. The laughter and scorn of the past were gone. In their place was a humble, desperate respect. One evening, as dusk painted the sky pink and orange, a frantic banging came at their door. It was Mrs. Beckett, her face drawn with exhaustion, her dress torn at the hem. Behind her, her husband staggered, holding a feverish child. "Please, Joe, Ruth, my Tom is burning up. No one else will take us in. The doctor's gone north. They say your Ruth knows how to bring down a fever. Please, we have nowhere else to go." Joe and Ruth didn't hesitate. They brought the Beckett boy inside, laying him on their own bed. Ruth immediately setting to work, water for compresses, tea steeped with wild mint, cool rags on the boy's forehead. Joe built up the fire and sent the twins to fetch more blankets. All the Maddox children helped, no questions asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Through the night, Ruth worked by lamplight, never leaving the sick child's side. When dawn came, Tom's fever finally broke, his breathing easing into a steady rhythm. Mrs. Beckett wept with gratitude, clutching Ruth's hands, promising repayment Joe would never accept. That was the first of many knocks. The O'Donnell family arrived after a barn fire, hungry and hollow-eyed. The Blackwoods came with 4 children, all coughing and weak. With each crisis, Joe's house filled, bedrolls on the floor, extra mouths at the table, the farm stretched nearly to breaking. Still, they made room, sharing what little they had. Ruth always insisting, "No one leaves here hungry or sick." It wasn't long before word reached the same men who had once laughed at Joe's bid. Some sent messages of thanks, others came in person, their pride battered, their voices low. Even Mr. Barrett appeared one day, hat in hand. "Maddox, the council has seen what you've done. The land tax, there'll be an exemption for those who take in orphans and help the town. We've all had to swallow our pride, I suppose." Joe nodded, keeping emotion from his voice. "We did what was right. That's all." But as he watched Ruth organize another batch of soup, Caleb guiding a frightened boy to the barn, and the twins teaching a younger girl how to feed the chickens, Joe felt a pride and gratitude so deep it almost hurt. For years, the world had watched and mocked, waiting for him to fail. Now, when the world faltered, it was his family, once unwanted, who became its shelter and its hope. Yet, in his heart, Joe wondered if this fragile peace could hold. For every wound that healed, there remained those who resented being helped by the very ones they once scorned. And as summer thunderheads gathered on the horizon, he feared the trials weren't over yet. The arrival of so many seeking refuge changed the Maddox farm in ways Joe could never have foreseen. What once was a haven for 7 lost children became a bustling community of the desperate and the hopeful. By midsummer, there were more than 20 mouths at the table. Neighbors, distant cousins, children whose parents had vanished or fallen ill. Joe and the older boys added bunks in the loft and strung blankets for makeshift walls. The twins and Rachel taught the newcomers how to sweep, fetch water, and share quietly at supper. Ruth worked without rest. She became the farm's heart, moving from the garden to the sick room, from the kitchen to the fields, managing each crisis with a steadiness that belied her years. She knew who needed extra bread at breakfast and who cried for their mother at night. Joe watched her with pride, his own hands rough from work but lightened by her growing leadership. But the strain showed. Tempers sometimes flared. The little ones fought over crumbs. Older boys argued about chores. One evening, as rain drummed the roof and lanterns flickered low, Caleb erupted at the table, voice sharp from exhaustion. "Why do we keep taking more in? We don't have enough. Soon we'll all go hungry." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Joe, his face grave but gentle, set his cup down. "Caleb, I remember what it felt like to be alone. No help coming. I promised that would never happen again. Not here. We'll make do the way we always have." Ruth placed a hand on Caleb's arm. "We're stronger together, even when it's hard." Caleb lowered his head, shame and stubbornness mingling in his eyes. Later that night, Joe found him in the barn, punching hay bales until his fists hurt. "I just get scared," Caleb admitted, breath hitching. "What if you send us away when there's no food left?" Joe sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're my son, Caleb. Nothing changes that. Not more mouths, not bad harvests, not fear. We face it together. Always." The next day, Caleb worked twice as hard, shoulders squared with renewed determination. Hardship sharpened their resourcefulness. Ruth organized the women to sew clothes from flour sacks, trading finished shirts for sacks of potatoes. The older boys fished the river, brought in rabbits from the hills, and even built new beehives to trade honey for salt and lamp oil. The garden, once meager, flourished under so many hands, rows of beans, squash, and onions pushing through dark soil. A small miracle in a hard season. Word of the Maddox farm's generosity spread. Travelers passing through stopped to barter, and sometimes just to rest. The preacher brought news of other families in need. Even Mrs. Beckett, who had once turned away, began to spend afternoons baking in Ruth's kitchen, sharing quiet laughter and old recipes. But not everyone welcomed the change. Some in Willow Bend grumbled that Maddox was turning the valley into a haven for beggars. Mr. Barrett, now more politician than banker, hinted at council meetings that perhaps the town should redistribute the burden. One evening, Joe found a note nailed to the fence. "Your kindness makes us weak. Stop taking in strangers or pay the price." Joe read it silently, his jaw set. He didn't mention the note to the children, but Ruth noticed the worry in his eyes. "You're not alone, Pa," she said softly. "If they come for us, we'll stand together. This is our home." Storm clouds gathered, both in the sky and in the town's heart. That week, a group of masked men rode up the lane in the dark, torches in hand. They shouted threats, demanding Joe send away the newcomers or risk having the house burned down. The children cowered behind the door, the younger ones sobbing. But Joe stood tall on the porch, his old rifle in his arms. Ruth and Caleb flanked him, fear clear in their faces, but outmatched by resolve. Joe called out, his voice like thunder, "You think fear will change us? We were forged in loss. You cannot take from us what the world already tried to steal. We stand together, and we don't run." The men muttered and hesitated, shamed by the sight of children gathered in the doorway, none turning away, none begging for mercy. After a tense standoff, the riders left, their courage dissolving into the night. In the silence that followed, Joe gathered his family around him. "No matter what comes," he said, voice gentle but fierce, "this home stands because we choose each other every single day. That's something no threat can ever burn away." Ruth hugged him tightly, the others pressing close. That night, as rain washed away the torches' scars, the Maddox family, by blood and by choice, felt stronger than ever. But even as peace returned, Joe knew the next test might be harder still. Willow Bend would not forget its pride so easily, nor forgive those who had proved them wrong. And the greatest challenge, the one that would ask the most of every heart in the house, was waiting just beyond the edge of dawn. Summer's end brought with it both bounty and dread. The Maddox farm was more alive than ever, with the harvest yielding more than Joe dared hope. Fat pumpkins, crates of potatoes, baskets of green beans, honey and eggs to spare. Yet for all the fullness in the cellar and laughter on the porch, Joe could feel the tension mounting in the valley. Every night, as dusk settled and lanterns were lit, he watched the road for signs of trouble, never fully able to shake the feeling that the peace they'd built was temporary. The children noticed too. Rachel started jumping at shadows, and Thomas refused to sleep without his older brother close. Even Ruth, usually steady as stone, took to double-bolting the doors and moving her bedroll closer to the little ones. Joe reassured them with soft words and steady hands, but in private he lay awake, listening for the sound of hooves or angry voices. One crisp morning, As the family gathered in the yard to sort apples, a rider approached at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat. It was Boone, the preacher's son, and a rare ally since the early days of scorn. He barely paused to dismount. "There's sickness in town," he said, breathless. "The Beckett boy and the O'Donnell twins. Nobody knows what it is, but the doctor's gone. Folks are scared, Joe. They're saying you brought it in with all these outsiders." Joe braced himself for the familiar sting of accusation, but Ruth stepped forward, her voice clear. "That's not true. We haven't left the farm in weeks, but we can help. We have clean water and herbs, and I know how to care for fever." Boone nodded, desperation overriding pride. "Will you come, Ruth? They trust you more than anyone." Joe didn't want to risk sending her, but Ruth's resolve was set. "I'll go," she said, gathering a satchel of supplies and hugging the little ones goodbye. Caleb insisted on going too, shouldering the responsibility with newfound maturity. As Ruth and Caleb rode into town, Joe gathered the remaining children close. "We help because it's right, not because they always deserve it. Sometimes kindness is the only weapon that matters." In Willow Bend, Ruth and Caleb found chaos, houses shuttered, mothers weeping, neighbors arguing in the street. At the Beckett home, Ruth worked quickly, cooling Tom's fever and brewing tea from wild mint and willow bark. Caleb fetched water, reassured the frightened, and kept watch on the porch. News of Ruth's care spread fast, and soon the O'Donnells, the Blackwoods, and others called for her help. For days, she barely slept, moving from sickbed to sickbed, treating wounds and easing pain with a gentle touch that even the hardest hearts could not ignore. In those tense, sleepless nights, Ruth's quiet courage became the hope of the town. Mothers brought her gifts, fresh bread, jars of preserves. The same men who once laughed at Joe's herd of orphans now thanked him with bowed heads and trembling hands. Even Mr. Barrett, never one for humility, admitted, "We'd have lost half the valley without your girl, Maddox." But as the sickness waned, another kind of fever gripped Willow Bend: shame. Some could not bear to meet Joe's eyes. Others tried to rewrite the story, pretending they'd always believed in his family's worth. The harshest voices in town grew quieter, replaced by new whispers, admiration, gratitude, even envy. Meanwhile, back at the farm, Joe and the younger children waited for news. Each evening, he'd sit on the porch, watching for Ruth and Caleb's return, his heart torn between fear and pride. When at last they rode in at dawn, Ruth's face drawn but triumphant, the family rushed out to greet them. "They're getting better," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion. "We did what we could." Joe hugged her tight, tears burning his eyes. "You did more than most would ever dare." That night, after the children were asleep, Joe and Ruth sat alone by the fire. The farm was quiet, the sky wide and deep with stars. "Do you think they'll ever truly accept us?" Ruth asked, her voice small. Joe considered a long time before answering. "Maybe not all. Maybe not right away. But you showed them who we are. You made them see. That matters more than anything." Ruth rested her head on his shoulder, the firelight soft on her tired face. "I used to be angry, Pa. At them, at you, at the world. But now, I just want to live. I want to be part of something good." Joe squeezed her hand, feeling a peace he'd not known since Mary died. "You are, Ruth. You all are. And whatever comes next, we face it as a family. No one begging for mercy will ever find our door closed. Not now, not ever." Yet even as hope flickered in the embers, Joe couldn't escape the feeling that the world would test them again. And next time, it might ask for more than kindness and courage alone. The frost of early autumn brought relief from illness, but also a biting edge of uncertainty. The Maddox farm, once viewed as a curiosity, had become a symbol of resilience to some, of unwelcome change to others. There were days now when neighbors brought gifts or stayed for supper, stories and laughter echoing off the old barn. But there were also days when Joe noticed unfamiliar men watching from the edge of the property, their hats pulled low, silent as crows. Joe tried not to let suspicion spoil the good days. The children returned to their routines, Rachel and Sarah weaving rugs from scraps, Thomas mending fence wire, Caleb learning to carve wooden toys for the little ones. Ruth spent her evenings by the fire, teaching Josie to read by lantern light. In those moments, the pain and chaos of the past seemed almost like a distant storm. But outside the farm, resentment simmered. Some townsfolk whispered that Joe was growing too influential, that he'd changed the order of things. Mr. Barrett, sensing a shift in public opinion, called another town meeting at the church. Joe was invited, no longer as an outcast, but as a man whose voice could not be ignored. The meeting was tense. Men argued about fairness, about who had borne the brunt of hardship and who deserved help. One farmer, gaunt and desperate, accused Joe of turning charity into power. "You take in everyone at Maddox, but now folks look to you instead of the council when there's trouble. That's not right." Joe stood slowly, his presence quiet but commanding. "I was laughed at for doing what you wouldn't, taking in the unwanted, the hungry, the lost. I didn't do it for power or thanks. I did it because I remember what it's like to be left out in the cold. We're stronger together. That's all I ever wanted." For a moment the room was silent. Then Mrs. Beckett, her voice trembling, spoke up. "If Joe hadn't helped us, we'd have buried our Tom. He never asked for a thing in return." More voices joined hers, grudging, then grateful. Barrett tried to regain control, but the tide had turned. The council voted to extend the land tax exemption and even to send supplies to struggling families, policies Joe had quietly championed. By the end of the night, it was clear that the world Joe and Ruth had built was beginning to shape the town itself. Returning home, Joe found Ruth waiting on the porch, a lantern swinging in her hand. She read his face before he spoke and smiled. "You did right, Pa. You always do." He hugged her, the hug holding both relief and a bittersweet ache. "I just told the truth. Sometimes that's all a man can do." But peace was short-lived. That week, a letter arrived from the county magistrate, an official notice that a distant cousin of one of the children, long thought dead, had resurfaced. The cousin claimed rights to the Maddox land, accusing Joe of manipulating orphans for personal gain. It was a cruel twist, and a threat that cut deeper than any gossip or rumor. Ruth read the letter aloud at the supper table, her voice trembling with anger. "After all this time, after all we've done..." Caleb slammed his fist on the table. "They can't take us away. This is our home." Joe kept his expression calm, but fear gnawed at him. He knew how fickle the law could be, how quickly a family built on hope and hard work could be ripped apart by a signature or a greedy hand. That night, after the children slept, Ruth found Joe alone by the barn, head bowed in the moonlight. She sat beside him, silent at first. "You always said we'd face whatever came together," she whispered. He nodded, voice low. "And I meant it. I won't let anyone take you, not as long as I draw breath." Ruth reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. "We'll fight, all of us. And if the town stands with us, maybe, just maybe, they'll see this place for what it is. A home, not a prize." Joe looked at her, seeing not the frightened girl from the auction, but a woman strong and sure, shaped by every hardship and every act of love. "We'll stand," he promised, "whatever comes." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, carrying with it the sense that change, good or ill, was coming fast. Yet inside, by the warmth of the lamp and the bond they'd forged, the Maddox family faced the future unbroken. But as dawn crept closer, Joe wondered, would mercy and love be enough to protect what mattered most when the world tried to take it all away? The letter from the magistrate cast a shadow over the Maddox farm. For days, an uneasy silence hung in the air, no matter how much laughter the children mustered, no matter how many chores filled the daylight hours. Ruth wrote back at once, carefully detailing the years they'd lived as a family, attaching affidavits from neighbors and the preacher. Joe made trips into Willow Bend to speak with the council and the sheriff, seeking allies where just a year before he'd found only scorn. While the legal wheels turned slow and indifferent, life on the farm went on. Harvest season arrived in earnest, with all hands working from dawn to dusk. Potatoes and squash, beans and apples filled crates in the cellar. Joe made sure each child knew that, no matter what happened, they belonged here, that nothing written on paper could erase what was written in their hearts. But as the days shortened and the first hints of frost rimmed the fields, tension from town began to creep closer. Strangers rode by more frequently, eyes lingering on the yard, sometimes stopping at the fence to ask questions in clipped voices. The children grew nervous. Rachel clung to Ruth's skirts. Thomas sharpened old knives more often than he used them for chores. One evening, as the family finished supper, the sheriff himself arrived at the door, hat in hand. Joe welcomed him in, offering a mug of coffee. The sheriff's expression was grave. "I won't lie to you, Joe. The cousin's got money, lawyers. He's stirred up some of the old families. They're talking like you stole what was theirs by right." Ruth bristled. "We've done nothing but help. This is our home." The sheriff nodded. "Most folks know it, but there are some who'd like to see you fail, just to put things back how they were. I'll do what I can, but the council will decide soon." After he left, Joe gathered everyone in the parlor. The fire crackled as faces young and old turned to him, eyes wide with worry. "We built this together," Joe said, his voice steady. "If they come for us, we stand as one. No Maddox leaves another behind." Caleb nodded, fierce. "We're not going anywhere." The next days brought a tense waiting. Some townsfolk rallied to their side, delivering signed letters for Ruth to send to the magistrate, testimonials of kindness, of lives saved, of the hope the Maddox family had given the valley. Even Mrs. Beckett stood on the church steps, speaking out for them in front of the whole congregation. This family did what the rest of us were too proud or too scared to do. Their Willow Ben's future. But there were others who grumbled, fueled by envy and the cousins' sly promises. Late one night, someone threw a rock through the parlor window. Joe swept up the glass and said nothing, but he slept little that week, ears sharp for every creak and murmur. Through it all, Ruth became the calm in the storm. She managed the house with an iron will, keeping the children's spirits high and the routines unbroken. She even managed to smile when the twins asked if the new lawman would put Pa in jail. "No one can take away what's true," she told them, brushing hair from Josie's brow. "As long as we hold on to each other, we're home." The day of the council hearing arrived cold and bright. Joe and Ruth rode into town, heads high, trailed by Caleb and Thomas for support. The meeting hall was packed. Neighbors, officials, even those who'd once mocked now jostling for seats. Barrett's voice rang out, slick and rehearsed, but Mrs. Beckett and Boone spoke fiercely for the Maddoxes. The sheriff's word carried weight. "I've watched this family grow. They saved more lives in 3 years than most do in a lifetime." When Ruth spoke, her words silenced the hall. "We didn't come here to take. We came because we were left with nothing. All we did was build something good and invite others in. Isn't that what this town needs most?" There was a long silence, broken only by the scratch of the clerk's pen. The council voted, 4 in favor of Maddox, 1 abstaining. The cousin's claim was denied. Joe felt his knees buckle, relief and gratitude crashing over him as Ruth squeezed his hand. Back at the farm that evening, the celebration was quiet but full of meaning. Rachel and Sarah baked sweetbread. Caleb and Thomas dragged out old lanterns and hung them from the porch. Neighbors brought pies and stories, laughter mingling with the autumn breeze. But as Joe watched his family gathered close, he knew the world would never be easy. There would always be voices whispering in the dark, always storms to weather. But what mattered, what would always matter, was that they faced it all, not as 7 lost children and a widower, but as a family no force on earth could break. And as the night deepened, Joe thought of all the ones who had once laughed at his choice, all the hands that had turned away. Now, if any came to his door, hungry, hurting, desperate for mercy, they'd find it. Because in this house, there was always enough room for hope. With the council's verdict behind them, a new season of life began for the Maddox farm. The relief that swept through the house was almost as palpable as the first spring wind after a long, frozen winter. The children moved through their days with a new confidence. The fear of being torn apart had vanished, replaced by laughter, plans for the future, and dreams they dared speak aloud. Ruth started drawing up new ideas for the garden, imagining rows of sunflowers and beans stretching to the horizon. Caleb, newly emboldened, talked about building a proper workshop for carpentry, and the twins pressed Joe to let them keep a pair of goats they'd rescued from a passing trader. Even Joe caught himself humming at his chores, the heavy years of loneliness now replaced by the warm, organized chaos of his chosen family. The town's attitude shifted as well. Those who had once looked down on the Maddox family now looked to them as a model for how to weather hard times. When a tornado touched down in the next valley, flattening 3 farms, Joe and his children were the first to organize help, mending roofs, sharing seeds and tools, comforting families who had lost everything. Their actions rippled through Willow Bend, inspiring others to lend a hand instead of standing apart. One Sunday afternoon, a line of wagons arrived at the Maddox farm, carrying families both familiar and new. There was a sense of celebration, of unity. Mrs. Beckett organized games for the children, while Boone led a raucous hymn on his battered guitar. The twins staged a play in the barn, making everyone laugh with their antics. At dusk, as the lanterns glowed and tables creaked under the weight of food brought by all, Joe stood and looked around at the circle of faces, some once strangers, many now family in all but name. He raised a glass of cider, his voice rough with emotion. "We made it through together. This farm stands because of every hand and every heart that refused to turn away. Whatever comes next, this place is yours as much as it's mine." Ruth smiled through tears, the words settling like a blessing over all assembled. Even Mr. Barrett, who'd spent so long resisting change, clapped Joe on the back, offering a quiet, "Well done, Maddox. You proved us wrong in the best way." As autumn painted the fields with gold and crimson, the Maddox family prepared for another winter, one they faced not with dread, but with anticipation. Caleb's workshop rose beside the barn, built by many hands. Ruth's garden flourished, feeding more mouths than ever before. The twins and younger children attended school for the first time, and their laughter returned home each evening, filling every corner of the house. But not all the changes were easy. As their reputation grew, so did the requests for help, from distant relatives, drifters, and townsfolk alike. Joe and Ruth sometimes disagreed on how much they could give. There were nights when Joe worried that their kindness would one day outpace their resources, that the world's needs would flood the sanctuary they'd created. One particularly hard week, when the last of the potatoes spoiled and a sick calf kept the whole family up at night, Joe's old doubts returned. He walked the fields in the moonlight, shoulders heavy, wondering if he'd taken on too much. Ruth found him by the fence, silent in the cold. "Pa," she said quietly, "I know it's hard, but we're not alone. We never have been. Not since that day at the auction. You gave us a place, and we gave you a family. Whatever happens, we face it as one." Joe looked at his daughter, seeing not the frightened girl he'd carried home, but a young woman stronger than any hardship. He hugged her, drawing strength from her conviction. "You're right, Ruth. As long as we have each other, we have enough." The next morning, help arrived in the form of neighbors bearing sacks of flour and seed potatoes, children bringing eggs and preserves. Even families they'd never met turned up to lend a hand. The Maddox farm, once a symbol of scorn, had become the valley's heart, and as the days grew short and frost returned, Joe realized that every kindness given, no matter how small, came back tenfold when most needed. It was not the land nor the crops, nor even his own hard work that secured their future. It was the love, resilience, and unity forged in the face of doubt. Still, as he watched Ruth plan the next planting and Caleb teach the younger boys how to build a fence, Joe wondered, when fate next tested them, when the world outside begged for mercy, would they be able to give as freely as before? Or had hardship changed them forever? Winter settled in with an iron grip, testing every promise of the Maddox farm. Heavy snows closed the road, isolating the valley for weeks at a time. The stockpile of potatoes and beans dwindled, and the days became a battle against cold, hunger, and uncertainty. Yet within the farmhouse walls, the family's spirit shone brightest when hardship pressed closest. Ruth kept order, her optimism undimmed by dark mornings and cold floors. She organized the children into teams, some tending to the animals, others hauling wood, a pair making sure no one skipped their share of the hot soup at supper. She taught the younger ones how to make toys from scraps, and her laughter, bright and resilient, became the house's heartbeat. Joe took to rising before dawn, checking fences and breaking ice in the watering troughs. He moved slower now, his joints stiff in the cold, but he made sure every child had boots, every belly was filled before his own. He told stories in the evenings, tales of Mary, of the first winters alone, of the auction that changed everything. Even Caleb, who had once eyed Joe with suspicion, now sat close, seeking advice and praise with shy pride. But the world outside their walls was not so easily kept at bay. As the weeks wore on, word came of neighboring farms in trouble. One bitter night, a desperate knock woke them all. At the door stood a group of townsfolk, men and women who'd once scoffed at Joe's army of strays, now hollow-eyed and shivering, their wagons mired in snow. "We lost everything in the last blizzard," one man choked, his voice thick with shame. "We can't feed the children. We need help." Joe looked at his own tired brood huddled behind him, Rachel's hand in Ruth's, the twins peeking out from behind Caleb's broad shoulders. He saw the fear in their eyes, the silent question. Could they spare anything more? Ruth stepped forward before he could answer. "You're welcome here," she said, steady and kind. "We have little, Kyung, but enough to share." With that, the Maddox family opened their doors wide, cramming every corner of the farmhouse with those in need. Blankets and quilts were spread across the parlor floor. Children doubled up in beds, and the kitchen bustled from before dawn till well after dark. No one went hungry, though rations thinned to the bare minimum. Every meal became an act of faith, an insistence that hope and generosity would outlast want. Not everyone was grateful. Some struggled with pride, refusing at first to take food or shelter. Others resented the reversal, recalling their old scorn with bitterness. Yet slowly, as days passed and the storm raged outside, even the most stubborn softened, drawn in by the warmth, the laughter, the simple rituals of family life that the Maddoxes had built. There were hard nights, tempers fraying as the cold stretched on and supplies shrank. Caleb intervened when an argument threatened to boil over, reminding everyone, "We're all in this together, like it or not." Ruth calmed crying babies. Sarah and Rachel made games out of chores, and Joe's steady presence kept hope alive. One morning, when the bread was nearly gone and the cellar empty of potatoes, Ruth gathered everyone in the parlor. "We have each other," she said, her voice bright and sure. "That's worth more than anything in the pantry. We've made it through worse. We will again." Her words were met with silence, then nods, then quiet resolve. The children began to sing, their voices rising above the howl of the wind. When the thaw finally came, the world outside was transformed, drifts receding to reveal muddy roads, battered fences, and, astonishingly, the first green shoots of spring pushing up through the snow. The guests packed up their meager belongings, offering tearful thanks. Many left behind tokens of gratitude, hand-carved spoons, a mended wagon wheel, promises of help at planting time. As they departed, Joe stood on the porch, watching Ruth help a little girl tie her shoes, Caleb lift a basket into a wagon, the twins waving goodbye. Pride welled in his chest, a pride not of possession, but of perseverance, of choosing compassion over comfort again and again. That night, when the house was quiet at last, Ruth sat beside Joe, their shoulders touching. "We gave everything," she said softly. "But look what we have." Joe took her hand, his voice rough with emotion. "The world laughed at us once, Ruth, but now when it needed mercy, it came here, and we gave it. That's worth more than anything I could ever own." But even as peace returned and the earth began to soften, Joe knew, each season brings its own test. And when the world came begging for mercy again, the Maddox family would answer. Not out of obligation, but out of the love that made them who they were. Spring arrived in a rush of birdsong and sunlight, washing away the last traces of hardship from the long winter. The Maddox farm bloomed with life, fruit trees budded, calves kicked in the pasture, and the garden, newly turned by dozens of helping hands, promised abundance for the seasons ahead. The scars of the past year were everywhere, faded boards where the wind had battered the barn, patches of earth still raw from floodwater. But hope, once tentative, now grew bold and unashamed. As soon as the roads cleared, the families who had found refuge at the farm returned, bringing gifts and labor in gratitude. Boone and his brothers built a new chicken coop from salvaged wood, while Mrs. Beckett and her daughters helped Ruth and the twins plant long rows of beans and squash. Caleb taught the younger boys to mend the fences and sharpen tools. Even Mr. Barrett arrived one afternoon, awkwardly dropping off a crate of seed potatoes, his words few but his presence proof of a changed heart. Joe watched it all with quiet satisfaction. The farm, once the site of jeers and gossip, now stood at the center of a community stitched together by hardship and compassion. Strangers came from farther afield, some seeking advice, some with children needing a place for a season, some simply drawn by the promise of honest work and fair treatment. Ruth welcomed each new arrival with the same steady hand, her experience growing with every challenge. She was no longer just the eldest orphan, she had become the farm's soul, a young woman whose voice commanded respect even from the men who had once dismissed her. Despite the sense of triumph, Joe never forgot how quickly fortune could shift. Late one evening, after the day's work was done and the children sprawled across the porch steps, Ruth joined him by the fence, looking out at the fields gilded by the last light. "Pa," she said softly, "do you remember that first night? When you brought us home and everyone laughed?" Joe smiled, the ache of memory gentled by time. "I remember thinking I was in over my head. I remember thinking the world wanted us to fail." Ruth touched his arm. "They were wrong. You gave us a home when we didn't even know how to want one. And now I can't imagine life anywhere else." Joe nodded, pride filling the spaces where grief had once lived. "You and your brothers and sisters, you made me a father again. You made me believe it was worth trying." They stood in companionable silence, the only sounds the chirr of crickets and the distant laughter of the twins. After a while, Ruth said, "Do you ever worry it'll all be taken away?" Joe considered the question, then shook his head. "Maybe once I did, but not now. We've built something real here, something that can't be auctioned off or mocked or burned down. Not as long as we remember who we are." The following weeks brought reminders of both the fragility and the strength of what they'd built. When a storm toppled the new chicken coop, Boone and Caleb rebuilt it in a day. When illness struck a neighboring farm, Ruth led the children in preparing baskets of food and medicines. Word spread that the Maddox family could be counted on, not because they had the most, but because they gave the most, even when they had little to spare. There were still skeptics. Sometimes a new arrival would eye Ruth or Caleb with suspicion, testing boundaries or muttering about charity, but these doubts never took root. The Maddox way, work hard, share what you can, stand together, became the model others aspired to. The farm, once a punchline, had become the heart of a new Willow Bend. One Sunday, as the sun set and supper finished, Joe looked around the crowded table, so many faces, so many stories, and felt a peace deeper than he'd ever imagined possible. "We made it," he said quietly. "Not just through winter, but through everything that tried to break us." Ruth squeezed his hand. "You gave us a place to belong, Pa. That's the greatest mercy there is." Joe smiled, grateful and humbled. "I think you all taught me more about mercy than I could ever teach you." That night, as fireflies drifted outside and the air hummed with the sounds of home, Joe finally allowed himself to rest, trusting in the family and the future he had built, one choice, one kindness, one hard-won day at a time. Yet as sleep claimed him, he knew life would always bring new challenges. But whatever the world asked next, the Maddox family would face it, together, unafraid, and always ready to answer cruelty with compassion. The days stretched longer as spring ripened into summer, bringing new warmth and new beginnings. The Maddox farm became a hub of activity, children running through tall grass, neighbors gathering for shared meals, and the sound of laughter rising over fields that once echoed only with the wind. Joe often paused to watch it all, marveling at how a home once marked by grief and emptiness now overflowed with purpose and joy. Ruth had come fully into her own. She managed not just the farm's accounts, but the flow of people and resources that passed through their doors. Her reputation as a healer and problem solver drew families from distant towns, mothers asking for advice, fathers seeking work for restless sons. Ruth never turned anyone away without a meal and a kind word, even when the days ran long and the larder threatened to run low. Caleb, too, had grown, a strong, steady presence on the land. He built a second barn with help from Boone and the twins, who were now old enough to drive the wagon and barter eggs in town. Rachel and Sarah, once timid and withdrawn, ran a little school for the youngest children in the parlor, teaching letters and numbers and songs learned at their mother's knee. Even Thomas and Benjamin, who had once quarreled over crumbs and chores, had become inseparable. Known in Willow Bend as the Maddox twins, though they were years apart, Joe's own role shifted as the family flourished. He took pleasure in smaller things, a fence mended well, a loaf of bread cooling in the window, the sight of the garden in full bloom. He stepped back when Ruth or Caleb took charge, pride outweighing any trace of the loneliness that had once been his only companion. One evening, as the family gathered on the porch after supper, Boone arrived with a letter, news from a distant town where trouble was brewing. A fever was spreading, and families were desperate for help. The council there asked if the Maddoxes might send supplies, perhaps even take in another orphaned child. Joe looked around at his family, at Ruth's calm certainty, Caleb's unwavering support, the hopeful faces of the younger children, and felt a flicker of doubt. Could they open their hearts any wider? Was there room for one more burden, one more soul in need? He left the decision to the family, gathering them around the table. "You all know what it's like to be alone, to be hungry and afraid. We can't save the whole world, but we can save one more. If that's what you want, we'll find a way." Ruth's answer was immediate. "We have enough, maybe just enough, but it's more than many ever get. If we can help, we should." Caleb nodded, and the others followed, their voices soft but sure. That night, as the lantern burned low, Joe sat on the porch, remembering the auction years ago, the laughter, the disbelief, the way people had looked at him as if he were mad. They were begging for mercy now, he thought, not from him, but from the very grace and kindness that once seemed foolish. He realized then that every struggle, every loss, every night spent wondering if they'd make it, had led them to this moment, to a home not built by walls or blood, but by courage, compassion, and the unwavering choice to stand together. A week later, the new child arrived, a thin, silent girl clutching a ragged doll. Ruth knelt to greet her, her voice as gentle as ever. "You're safe here. You have a family now." The girl's eyes filled with tears, not of fear but of relief. And as the Maddox children led her inside, showing her where to wash and where to sleep, Joe felt the last remnants of doubt fall away. The Maddox farm, once a place of sorrow, had become the heart of a new way of living, one where mercy was given freely, not because it was deserved, but because it was needed. Joe knew there would be more hard winters, more days of uncertainty. But whatever came, they would meet it as they always had, together, strong in the face of adversity, and always willing to open their doors to those left out in the cold. As dusk settled and the children's laughter faded into night, Joe sat on the porch steps, content at last. The world could laugh, could scorn, could beg for mercy at their door, but the Maddox family would answer with kindness every single time. The heat of midsummer bore down on Willow Bend, and for the first time in years, the town felt truly changed. The Maddox farm, once mocked, once shunned, was now the heart that pumped hope through the valley's veins. And yet, just as the corn reached for the sky and the orchard heavy with promise, the greatest test of all arrived on the wind. A dry lightning storm struck one evening, fire streaking the distant hills. Within hours, flames raced across the brush, devouring old fence lines and driving terrified animals ahead of the orange glow. Joe and Caleb gathered every able-bodied hand, leading neighbors and children alike to dig trenches and form bucket brigades. Ruth organized the youngest, keeping them safe in the root cellar, comforting those who wept and leading songs to quiet their fears. The fire drew closer, the sky a wild, flickering red. Smoke thickened the air, stinging eyes and lungs. For 2 nights and a day, the Maddox farm became a fortress, every soul working side by side, driven not by fear, but by the fierce love they held for one another. At the worst of it, a wall of flames threatened the southern pasture. Joe found himself at the front, muscles shaking, hands raw from hauling water and earth. He looked back and saw Caleb, face streaked with soot, refusing to retreat. Ruth appeared beside them, pressing a wet cloth to Joe's neck, her calm unwavering. "Pa, the wind's shifting. If we hold the line here, we can save the house." It was madness, a final gamble. Joe nodded, determination hardening his features. They rallied everyone for one last push. Buckets passed from hand to hand, shovels scraped trenches deeper, and prayers rose unbidden into the smoke-choked night. As dawn broke, the wind finally died. The fire, beaten back, smoldered at the edges of their land but did not cross. Exhausted, the Maddox family, Joe, Ruth, Caleb, the twins, every child and neighbor, stood in silence, staring at blackened earth and singed fences. The house still stood, scarred but safe. News of their stand swept through Willow Bend. Families who had once laughed at Joe's choices now sent food and lumber, eager to help rebuild. Boone arrived with a cart full of tools and a dozen volunteers. Even Mr. Barrett, long the farm's fiercest critic, pitched in, his shirt soaked with sweat as he raised new beams alongside Caleb and Thomas. The weeks that followed were a blur of work and gratitude. Neighbors repaired what the fire had ruined. Children replanted fields and gardens. Ruth nursed the weak and consoled the grieving. The farm was never empty. A steady flow of visitors, helpers, and those who needed shelter passed through, all finding a welcome. One evening, as the work wound down and a golden sunset spilled across the land, the entire community gathered at the Maddox farm. A great table was set beneath the surviving apple trees, every dish contributed by grateful hands. Laughter and stories filled the air. Mrs. Beckett stood and raised a glass. "There was a time we scorned this family, mocked what we couldn't understand, but when fire came for us, it was Joe and his children who saved us all. We were the ones who begged for mercy, and mercy is what we received." The crowd echoed her words, some with tears, all with new respect. Ruth, cheeks flushed, stood to speak. "What we built here was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about refusing to let the world decide who deserved kindness. My father bought us at auction, yes, but it's love, not money, that makes a family." Joe, humbled and overwhelmed, squeezed Ruth's hand as the crowd cheered. For a long moment, he watched faces once twisted in scorn now shining with gratitude. The Maddox farm had become what he and Mary once dreamed, a refuge, a promise kept, a living answer to every cruelty the world had thrown their way. Later, as darkness wrapped the land in peace, Joe wandered the fields. He paused at the edge of the old fence, the same spot where, years ago, he'd wondered if he was a fool for taking in so many lost souls. Now the only sound was the hum of summer insects, the laughter of children drifting from the porch. He realized, with a swell of pride and humility, that mercy had not only saved the ones he loved, it had redeemed the whole valley. Those who had laughed now looked to his family for hope and guidance, and should the world ever forget, should cruelty or fire return, the Maddox family and all those they had drawn to their table would stand together, unbreakable. As he turned to go inside, Joe whispered a silent thanks to Mary, to fate, and to the power of choosing love, even when the world called it foolish. The seasons passed, and the Maddox farm, once a symbol of ridicule, now a beacon of hope, became woven into the very soul of Willow Bend. The blackened scars from the Great Fire slowly faded beneath new grass and wildflowers planted by dozens of hands. The fences were rebuilt stronger than before. Fruit trees once charred burst forth with blossoms, each petal a sign of renewal and resilience. Life resumed its rhythm, but it was never quite the same. The Maddox's table remained long and crowded, with familiar faces and newcomers alike. Ruth's quiet leadership drew praise from all corners. Neighbors brought their children to learn at her feet, trusting her wisdom as they once never could. Caleb's hands built not just barns but bridges, literal and figurative, connecting families once separated by suspicion. Rachel and Sarah, now grown, became teachers at the church school, while Thomas and Benjamin found their own places as craftsmen and farmers. Joe watched it all with wonder. His heart filled each evening as he sat on the porch, the air thick with the scent of summer and wood smoke. He'd aged, his step a little slower. But the burdens he once carried had been replaced by a pride so deep it brought tears on the quietest nights. He'd built more than a farm. He'd built a legacy, one rooted in the simple belief that no act of kindness is ever wasted. The Maddox family had become the valley's safety net. When illness struck, when storms returned, when yet another stranger appeared at their door with nothing but a name and a plea, they found welcome and warmth. Some stayed only a season, others forever. And the laughter that once echoed with mockery in Willow Bend now rang out as celebration, the world transformed by the courage to care. Each year, on the anniversary of the fire, the whole town gathered at the Maddox farm for a great feast beneath the apple trees. Stories were shared, songs sung, hands joined in gratitude. Joe would always say a few words, never boastful, always simple. We made it by standing together. Remember that when the world tests you again. But as the years rolled by, the Maddox's mercy became more than just a local legend. Travelers took the tale of the widower and his 7 children across counties and borders. Some came seeking help, others just to see if the rumors were true. And each time, the Maddoxes lived their truth. Giving, sharing, sheltering, never turning anyone away who truly needed a second chance. As his hair silvered, Joe sometimes sat alone in the dusk, remembering that auction day, how everyone had laughed, how hopeless he'd felt, how much was at stake in a single moment of courage. He thought of Mary, gone but never far, her spirit present in every child's laughter and every act of forgiveness. One final test came in Joe's last years, a drought that threatened the valley, bringing back fear and hunger, but the community he'd helped build did not break. They pooled grain and water, shared what little they had, and survived as they always had, together. And when the rains finally came, the Maddoxes were there to help everyone rebuild, just as they always had, one hand and one heart at a time. In his last season, Joe sat on the porch as Ruth read a letter aloud, news from a family he'd never met. "We heard about the mercy in Willow Bend. We hope to make a place like yours someday." Joe smiled, tears shining, knowing his family's story would live on long after he was gone. And when he passed, the whole valley mourned, not just for the man, but for the lesson he'd taught, that mercy given is never wasted, and that every family, no matter how it begins, can become a light to the world. Ruth carried on his legacy, the Maddox farm remaining a place where laughter, learning and healing never ceased. No matter how hard the world grew, there was always a welcome here. And whenever someone new crossed their threshold, Ruth would say, "You're home now. Here. No one begs for mercy. We offer it freely." If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, compassion, and the power of found family. Share this video with someone who needs hope, or a reminder that mercy and kindness can change the world, even when it seems impossible. Stay with us for the next tale, a new journey, another hard-won home, another proof that the bravest thing you can do is open your door. Thank you for listening. And remember, kindness is never wasted.